are characterized by commanding and the reactive forces by obeying. But there's an interesting point in here, you know, active and reactive, commanding, obeying. Now, we said that forces do come out of quantitative differences in relations, producing qualitative differences. So these commanding active and reactive turns out to be the qualities of the forces. Qualities of the forces, not according to physical equations, mathematical equations, or mechanical equations, but according to, as I told you, I'm going to talk about it later on once again, okay? According to the evaluations of superiority and inferiority, okay? Now, the term evaluations here is very important. Because if we take this out, if we take the notion of evaluation out from the sentence or phrase, what we will be left with is nothing else than superiority and inferiority. Now, we are not talking about the real superiority and inferiority here, okay? We are talking about the evaluation of superiority or evaluation of inferiority, okay? So this means that the intricate relation among the commanding and obeying forces, okay, means that it is not necessary that the obeying forces are weaker than the commanding forces, okay? They are obeying because of their evaluation of themselves in terms of inferiority and evaluation of the other commanding forces in terms of superiority, okay? And vice versa, okay? Not because they are weak and these are powerful, okay? It has nothing to do here with the question of the relative power. Therefore, we are not talking about the Hegelian notion of domination here. No, not at all, okay? This is not a matter of domination, master's domination over the slave, no, or servant, okay? This is a matter of evaluation. Now, it would be strange to you, perhaps, to see that forces are making evaluations of themselves, of the other forces that they encounter, okay? But this is, according to Nietzsche, okay, how the body would work, okay? It starts inside the body, evaluation. He would later on talk about evaluation and revaluation of the values, for instance, okay? So what's at stake here is the point of the emergence of the values at the same time, okay? Values of superiority and inferiority, okay? So, talking about active and reactive, okay, Nietzsche would identify the active as noble and the reactive as base, and he would interpret the history of modernity, European modernity, as the history of decadence, okay, meaning a term by which he means that, okay, throughout the modern period, as the history progresses, actually, the reactive forces beginning to influence the active forces, okay? And therefore opening up a new age of nihilism, okay? Now the point, however, don't forget this, the point was that we owe the development of the consciousness to the workings of the reactive forces. If you like, a body which fall prey to the power of the reactive forces, in other words, okay, would develop consciousness, okay? For which case we were talking about the servants, okay? It was the servant rather than the master who would develop consciousness, because it was the servant who was in the need of learning what the other does, how the other thinks, how the other commands, and how he himself can react to these demands and commands or dictates, and how he himself can cope with the situation. Okay? Out of this, all these strategies of accommodation, accommodating and regulating comes out of the development of consciousness, and such a reactively developed consciousness poses the problem of action in terms of available means and determined ends. However, in contrast to this, in the case of the master, okay, since the operating forces, active forces, okay, active forces meaning here commanding the rest of the forces constituting the body, okay, does not take care of what the other forces inside the body would react. Okay? Now, a few maybe quotations would be in order. Again, if I can find them. Okay, I wasn't able to find them. Okay, I found them, okay. The bodies, I quote from Deleuze, the body's active forces make it, this is a very important notion actually, I'm lucky to find it. The body's active forces, otherwise I was about to forget, active forces make it a self. The body's active forces make it a self and define the self as superior and astonishing. Now Deleuze quotes from Nietzsche, a most powerful being, an unknown sage, he is called self. He inhabits your body, he is your body, Nietzsche says. Okay. Now, interestingly enough here, okay, Nietzsche brings with a certain concept self rather than subject. The self, yourself. Actually, this self is nothing other than that self Kant was talking about. Okay, when he says that the empirical self is nothing else than a manifold of flux of intuitions, which in itself is neither understandable nor intelligible. Okay? It is a big X, an unknown. Okay? So it is this self Nietzsche brings forth, that empirical self, that your own living self, so to speak, okay? A live self, not a frozen consciousness, not a structure, but always and always a bundle of always interacting forces, okay? And in this relationship of forces, there is a certain degree of tension, you know? But that degree of tension is overcome by the commanding act of the active forces. Okay? Of course, not absolutely, never perfectly. And this does as well not mean that by obeying, the obeying reactive forces loses any of their power. Okay? No, this never is the case according to Nietzsche. Okay? Or he says that obeying itself is a power. And by obeying, reactive forces does not give up any of their power. Okay? So that they remain still powerful. And as I told you, the relationship of superiority and inferiority giving rise to the qualitative differences of active and reactive is not based upon the question of power. Okay? It is based upon the question of evaluation, how forces evaluate one each other and themselves, okay, in a certain relationship. So actually, we need to little bit dwell perhaps on this notion of the self. As you can see, there is no question at all with regard to the historicity of this self. Okay? This self would continuously being created and recreated, never ever assuming or constituting the same forces operating inside it. Always the commanding forces, always and only, can keep the bundle together, the relationship of the forces of active and reactive together for a certain while, of course. Okay? And after that, the tension perhaps may break up and the body dissolves. Okay? Disappears. As it comes from nothing, if you like, okay, it vanishes into nothing. And nothing here means nothing, not in the Heideggerian sense. I'm saying nothing is not nothing. Okay? Nothing means here nothing. Actually, if you are interested on this with this topic, you'll find a very interesting discussion in Aristotle's text on Genesis and corruption, otherwise translated as coming into being and passing away. Okay? Okay, he says that Deleuze, I quote Deleuze from Deleuze, appropriating, possessing. Okay, let's start with the first line. What is active? Reaching out for power. This is taken from Nietzsche. Now Deleuze continues. Appropriating, possessing, subjugating, dominating. These are the characteristics of active force. Okay? To appropriate means to impose forms, to create forms by exploiting circumstances. Okay? So, at the same time, what we are talking about, a force of metamorphosis inside the body. Okay? It's simply that reactions cannot be grasped or scientifically understood as forces. Okay? If they are not related to superior force. This is an interesting idea, actually, which relates us to the Lukácsian question of the development of a working class consciousness and its truth value. Okay? Let me read once again. It is simply that reactions cannot be grasped or scientifically understood as forces if they are not related to superior forces. Forces of another type. The reactive is a primordial quality of force, but one which can only be interpreted as such in relation to and on the basis of the active. Now, if Nietzsche was right, assuming, okay, if Nietzsche was right, okay, the reactive forces, we are talking about working class, which is demanded to develop a certain consciousness. Okay? of its own, of course. But the problem was that working class had proven itself not to be capable of doing so. Okay? And instead of the working class, some intelligentsia, well-educated men, began to develop a certain theory of the consciousness of working class, okay? Scientific materialism or whatever name you call it, okay? Then tried to tried to transfer it to the working class, okay? But the problem was that working class was quite resistant to take it. Now, if Nietzsche's interpretation was right, and if what's at stake is the development of consciousness on the part of the working class, there may appear two options, as you can see. One, either the working class is the active part here, therefore resisting to develop any kind of consciousness, on the one hand, which is, it appears, not the case, simply because working class acts with a consciousness, but the complaint was that, within Marxist circles, was that it acts with false consciousness, okay? So that then the second option appears and turns out to be more viable, if you like, that actually working class develops a consciousness, but develops a reactive consciousness, okay? And reactive consciousness does not belong to the working class, don't forget. It belongs actually, or it is the consciousness of the master, who himself having no consciousness at all, okay? Perhaps, for instance, if that dilemma, you can attribute culture to the dominant class, developing culture, doing things in a sublimated nature, if you use the Freudian language, but not developing consciousness. And consciousness is developed on the part of the worker, on the part of the masses, adopting the false consciousness, adopting the, or developing the consciousness of the dominant class. Now, that would be an interesting interpretation, actually, and would set Nietzsche in a sharp contrast to working class, or Marxist thinking. Okay. Okay, that was a very interesting comment, actually, possibility at least. Okay, we have talked about it, and etc. As for sciences, okay, as for sciences, Deleuze says that Nietzsche believes that science, in the way it handles quantities, always tends to equalize them to make up for inequalities, okay? In that regard, Nietzsche turns out to be critical of three major attitudes in the domain of sciences, okay? The scientific mania for seeking balances, utilitarianism and egalitarianism proper to science, okay? These express themselves, this attitude express itself in the logical identity, the notion of identity in logic, if you like, okay? In the notion of equality in mathematics, and the notion of equilibrium in physics. Okay. For instance, there comes an interesting comment by Deleuze here with regard to the theory of the conservation of energy. Okay. Conservation of energy as a theory, you mean, okay, accepts the possibility, actually, actuality of the transmission of one form of energy into another form, and so to speak, therefore accepts change. But before doing this, it presupposes that there is a constant amount of energy, okay? There is a constant amount of energy, one form of energy changing into another form of energy, and establishing always, all the time, between these forms of energy, equalities or equilibriums in equal quantities. Okay. However, the problem is that if we open up here, right here, if we open up the question of becoming, or as Deleuze introduces us with the help of the notion of the eternal return, according to Nietzsche, there can't be no constant here in eternal return, okay, or in the process of becoming, okay. Okay, forces relating themselves with other forces, producing new entities, if you like, new beings into the process of becoming, okay, and these beings disappearing in time, but never in equality, okay, never and ever equality, and it turns out to be even impossible to talk about a constant here, a constant amount of this or a constant amount of that. More than that, okay, the theory of conservation of energy assumes the unity of being on the other hand, okay, the homogeneous, within this heterogeneity, the homogeneous unity of being. But as we will see, there appears a very difficult problem in our thinking, starting with Nietzsche here, okay? Nietzschean forces and the process of becoming, which is eternally returning, so to speak, okay, does not accept such a unity. Neither homogeneous nor heterogeneous. Actually, such terms turn out to be irrelevant within this context, okay? What this practically means that if I apply this to the unity of consciousness, what would I get is nothing else than the existence of dark points. Actually, non-existent spheres within the structure of consciousness, which will give us a certain concept of unconscious in case of a Sigmund Freud, for instance. Okay? So the consciousness or the unity can never be total, okay? And the size, the quantity of the unity, if you like, can never be a constant, but always subject to change, okay, in this eternal return of the becoming, okay? Now, Deleuze says that, according to Nietzsche, the eternal return is in no sense a thought of the identical. This is what I was trying to say. But rather a thought of synthesis, a thought of the absolutely different, which calls for a new principle outside science. This principle is that of the reproduction of diversity as such, of the repetition of difference. Okay? So eternal return does not, or the process of becoming is not the process of becoming to produce something. Okay? Things are coming and going, and the process of becoming, or from the point of view of the process of becoming, all these comings and goings are irrelevant. Okay? Now, this implies a very different and difficult conception of history and temporality as well. As you can see, now we are not talking about a progressive time. Okay? To be able to talk about progressive time, on the first place, one needs a subject of time. Okay? In the Hegelian case, for instance, we had the Geists, whose developments producing the temporality, you know. So from the very beginning to the end, the subject of history was Geist. Okay. On the other hand, in its Marxist version, Marxian version, we have seen that it was the society and its class struggle, okay, producing time. Okay. It was the class struggle forcing the entity unity to pass from one stage to the another. Now, class struggle functions as a dynamic, just like the dialectic of the Geist in Hegelian discussion, okay? While society occupies the place or corresponds to the conceptualization of unity in the form of a Geist, okay? When I'm talking about particular societies, I am talking about smaller histories. When I'm talking about the human history, for instance, starting with the primitive commune, arriving at the slave society, then passing from there to the feudal society, and finally arriving at the capitalist society, and which someday perhaps will culminate in the foundation or formation of the socialist and communist society. Now, we are talking about a history, universal history, written from a human perspective. Okay? In contrast to the Geist, Marx was right. He was not talking about abstract entities. He was talking about living human beings. But the notion of society exceeds the actuality of the living human beings, as you can see, okay? And turns out to be, unfortunately, another conceptualization. Fine, all right, okay? However, in the Nietzschean context, what we see here is exactly the denial of the possibility of any subject, okay? Eternal return is indifferent to the formation of comings into beings and passings away in it, okay? So, eternal return is not there, according to Nietzsche, as to produce some specific item, okay? Some specific entity, like human being, human consciousness, or whatever you like. Okay, the eternal return is not the permanence of the same. In Hegel, in Marx, as you can see, it was the permanence of the same. Okay? The equilibrium state or the resting place of the identical is not the equilibrium state or the resting place of the identical. It is not the same or the one which comes back in the eternal return, but return is itself the one which ought to belong to diversity and to that which differs. Okay? Another contribution that such an approach makes to a certain conceptualization of temporality is this. I'm going to read it because I do not like to confuse any of ideas in it. Okay? Quoting from Deleuze, Nietzsche says that if the universe had an equilibrium position, it would already have attained. But the present moment, as the passing moment, now we are introduced with a new concept, present moment as the passing moment, proves that it is not attained, and therefore that an equilibrium of forces is not possible. By virtue of what Nietzsche calls the infinity of the past time, the argument depends upon the idea of the infinity of the past time. The infinity of past time means that becoming cannot have started to become. That it is not something that has come, but not being something that has become, it cannot be a becoming something. Okay. Not having become, it would already be what it is becoming if it were becoming something. That's to say, past time being infinite, becoming would have attained its final state if it had one. Okay. Now, from this discussion, one can understand that what's at stake in the notion of the eternal return is nothing else than this unceasing interplay of the forces. Süremizi geçmedik değil mi? Saatim durdu mu diye baktım. Interplay of the forces continuously differing from each other, continuously constituting bodies in a rather generic fashion. Okay? Now, however, Nietzsche here would add one more component to his discussion, okay, which is quite famous. He is quite famous by that notion, actually. Will to power. Okay, this is an unfortunate conceptualization which had been misunderstood countless of times. It had been presented as a desire to have power over others, etc., etc. Indeed, it does not mean anything else than becoming, or if you like, coming into being, okay, and persisting there for a while. Okay, that's all. It does not mean anything else. Okay, but here there is a strange notion, of course, the notion of will, with which we are quite familiar up to until now. Okay, developed out of the ancient times, processed through scholastic discussions, finally arrived at the modern times, and closely attached to our modern conceptualization of the human subject. Okay. As for human subjects, two major characteristics. Of course, you know, one is rational thinking. Okay. To be able to talk about a human being as subject, if you like, okay, one needs to attribute these two qualities to that human being. Okay. The first one is, of course, is rational thinking. The other one is free will. Okay. Without this, we could not develop our conception of the modern subject and would not be able to erect many huge institutions upon it. Okay? For instance, all our political systems, assuming that human beings, the subjects of a country, are subjects in the sense that they are having these two qualities, rational thinking and free will. Otherwise, you wouldn't be. All the legal systems, okay, not only modern, to be able to punish a culprit would need to assume that the culprit under question, okay, would at least have a certain degree, display a certain degree of rationality. In other words, this has been expressed in the language of law, having the command of his or her own mind. Otherwise, punishment cancels out, fades away, and the person is sent to another institution, psychiatric institution. You know, being immune from any punishment. Okay. So that to be able to even punish, we need to assume that the culprit would display a certain degree of rationality and as well, of course, free will. Otherwise, if there is no free will in the human being, in the doer of the deed, in other words, you would not blame, you would not attribute the criminal act to that person. Okay? Only in the capacity of an instrument, in such cases, these people would be able to be punished. Okay? But the real author remaining hidden. Türkçe'de ne diyor? Azmettirici. Yapan tetikçi, öbürü azmettirici. Okay, so these gotta be in place. Okay, these two characteristics. So Nietzsche makes use of that notion. It is strange. Okay, actually, elsewhere he was quite critical about that notion. Yani we are talking about will to power, will to power, will to power. What do we mean by this? By this. What is this will? Okay? Usually, a notion of will can only be understood only and only in connection with a certain subject. Okay? My will, your will. Your will is putting you to act in that direction. My will is putting me to act in another direction. Okay? So you will it and I will that. Okay? However, this will here does not refer to any subjectivity at all. Actually, it does not connect it with the idea of consciousness at all. Okay? As we have seen, we are developing these discussions within the framework of body, not consciousness. Okay? So this will is something in the Nietzschean sense pertaining to not necessarily to the body, but to the forces. Okay? Pertaining to the forces. Actually, it is nothing else than a synthesis of the relations of forces. Okay? A synthesis of the relations of forces. But yet, Nietzsche would insist that it is inside the force as a distinct element. So it would be an error to equalize will with force. Okay? So when the will enters into the picture, actually what we are talking about, this synthesis of the relations of forces. In other words, we are talking about the interaction of the active and passive reactive forces, okay? And now as well, okay, belonging to the body, as the synthesis of the forces shows itself here in their interaction, in the relationship of their commanding and obeying, okay, and turning the body into an active body or reactive body, okay? So it is as if something of the forces coming into confrontation and assuming a certain directionality which would decide what the body will do, what the body will tend to, where the body will direct itself. Okay? So corresponding to these active and reactive forces, we are talking about, in Nietzschean terminology and theory, talking about the affirmative and negative forces. Okay? Affirmative forces are forces. Before that, let me return back to the notion of force and compare the force and will. Okay? It is something like this. Nietzsche says that force is what does. Okay? Will is what wills. Okay? This is the difference. The wills are attached or ascribed to the forces. They may never be separate from the forces, but they are not the same with the forces. Actually, they emanate, they form themselves, the will, active and affirmative and reactive will, form themselves in connection with the relative positioning of the forces. So there is no absolute will either, okay? And we are never ever talking about any freedom of the will either, okay? Will is there, emerging out of the interaction of the forces, okay? The affirmative will in connection with the active forces and reactive, negative will in connection with the reactive forces, okay? Now, so it is the force that which does and will that which wills. But however, you would never think about that which wills in connection with a thinking consciousness. As you can see, these events are taking place in the body and actually, if not totally, but at least to a greater extent, unconscious. Okay? So the formation of the will then can be attributed to the unconscious operation of the unconscious forces, not to any rational capacity of thinking. Okay? So Nietzsche sets here a sharp contrast with the traditional Western thinking, okay? Emphasizing or preferring to base the existence on an idea of consciousness. Okay? Here, what's at stake? The operating forces, their interaction, determining certain wills at certain moments in the history of their interacting, okay? And these wills directing those forces and forces doing what they are going to do. Okay? Now, as for the affirmative will, affirmative will and negative will are rather strange to explain. Okay. First of all, let's start with simples. Okay. Affirmative will affirms whatever comes as they come. Okay. Affirms whatever comes as they come. Okay. This is a very difficult notion. It does not mean that it does not struggle with it. Okay. It does not mean that it yields to the coming whatever. Okay. It does not care about it, it means. Okay. It does not care much about it. Therefore, it does not develop a resistance, and therefore it does not develop a consciousness about it. Okay. That's the basic problem. However, negative will resists or tries to resist the coming of becoming. Okay? It wants to preserve itself, in other words, while affirmative will does not have any such concern of self-preservation or whatever. Okay? It just lives and affirms whatever comes as it comes. Okay? Now, this is the easiest way. However, there is another another approach is possible to them. The affirmative will in connection with active forces tries, let me put this, tries to do what it wills. Okay? But the negative will in connection with the reactive falls always short of what it wills. Okay? Now this creates an interesting situation reminiscent of the Fichtean discussion of the rise of the distinction between externality and internality. Okay? Now, the affirmative will only knows its own self and tries to realize it. Okay? Regardless of the question whether it can really do it or not. It's not important. It can perish in trying to do it, but it's okay. Okay? No problem. It wills it, and it directs all its efforts, all the forces of the active, okay, into the realization of death's will. Okay? It does not care about the possible barriers, the dangers of realizing that will, etc., etc. Okay? However, the reactive will, being always considered about the situation, always considers the possible dangers and possible strategies as to cope with dangers and the transformations in the environment and how to accommodate with these changes, each and every change being a threat for the self-preservation of the what it was, negative will. Okay? Therefore, always and all the time falls short of doing what it itself wills. That's why it's called negative will. Okay? It is negating its own will. in other words. That's why this creates such a situation. If the possibility of willing extends from point A to point C, for instance, or vector C, just like in Fichte, remember, okay? Fichte was making a similar analysis when he was analyzing the structure of thinking as an activity. Now here we are in the processes of the body, and we are trying to analyze the relationship of the will and force and their environment. Okay? Now here, for instance, affirmative will wills try to do what it wills up until the point C, even if it may cause its own extension. Okay? However, the negative will always fall short of doing it. Okay? Now, as you can see, it is this distance, this gap between what it wills and what it actually do, okay, that creates the distinction between external and internal, and gives rise to the notion of the consciousness in the formation of the reactive forces together with the negative will. Okay? It is in that regard Nietzsche denies any possibility of developing consciousness on the part of the active forces together with affirmative will, which he sees as the noble belonging to the master, etc., etc., okay? Because they do not care about the external, therefore they do not know about the external. All they do is their own valuations, okay? Their own valuations. Actually, Nietzsche would see that all values are the values of the master, okay? Why? Simply because all those having reactive, negative will, acting with reactive forces, okay, would then try to look at what the master thinks, what the master does, and would then therefore therefrom develop their own consciousnesses, okay? Their own consciousnesses primarily focusing on the problem of knowing what the other thinks, what the other does, what the other can do, okay? However, on the part of the master, there cannot rise any such question of the other. In that regard, the master turns out to be a solitude man without having any knowledge of the consciousness. Knowledge in the sense of the knowledge of the consciousness, okay? We are going to talk about, or Nietzsche would rather talk about, a different kind of knowledge on the part of the master. Body knowledge, okay? The body knows, he would say, of course, in different terms, not in discursive terms, and the knowledge of the body in its relationship to consciousness would, of course, body is knowledge, I mean, would, of course, turn out to be some element of unconscious, okay? Okay, let's break here. Do you have any questions? Okay. We may continue a couple of minutes on Nietzsche next session, and then later on, who was there? Freud.